52% of all pregnancies, African American pregnancies, end in abortion. And they were having a conference there, and I heard Akua Farrow in her presentation talk about the Negro Project, and talk about Margaret Sanger, and talk about the 1,000 at that time, 1,452 African American children that were killed each day by abortion. And needless to say, the targeting, the systemic way it was presented, the diabolical plan and the ideology was staggering. And I was shocked, because here I am, a shepherd, and my goal and my charge is to protect the sheep and to guard them against the wolf. And here, this is going on right underneath my nose, so to speak, in our community, unabated. And no one was challenging the Planned Parenthoods, the abortion industry, and no one was challenging the African American leadership that was actually, I would find later, condoning not only abortion, but also benefiting from abortion. So that began the quest that we're on right now, and which led to us being major players in the pro-life movement. Well, Margaret Sanger was a devout racist, and that's what people need to know first. And her ideology was one, of course, that we are now finding out more and more today, that basically stemmed from Darwinism, that the survival of the fittest, and that a master race more or less should be bred, and that African Americans, Australians, and other ethnicities that they deemed were inferior needed to be either exterminated or their numbers reduced greatly. And so she birthed the Negro Project with the sole purpose of introducing sterilization and abortion to the African American community, and to do it in such a way that they would not be suspicious of her true master plan, and that was to sterilize and reduce the numbers of the community. She was brilliant in her strategy. She also perceived that if you're going to reach the African American, you have to do it from a religious persuasion. You would have to be cleared through the leadership of the church, and so she told Clarence Gamble, the heir of Procter & Gamble, that we ought to hire 3 or 4 colored ministers with engaging personalities and from social service backgrounds to make sure, more or less to be the face of it, to make sure that if anyone should suspect anything, that they would be able to quell any suspicions from the congregation or the people. And so, but that was very insightful insight, and that is how our community, even today, if you look at sociologically speaking, the most respected person in the African American community is still the preacher. Believe it or not, it's still the preacher. And second, the doctor. Third, the politician. She perceived that early and went out and began to commandeer clergy. As a matter of fact, they had contests where they awarded preachers who would give the best sermon to basically to facilitate this plan for the Negro Project, a eugenics sermon, so to speak. And they were awarded money. Planned Parenthood, they have a board of clergy. Recently in Portland, they opened up a mega killing station, and it was clergy present at the inauguration. Once again, this, allows it to appear to be socially acceptable when you put a cleric in front with a collar and is talking about the good social good this is going to do for the community. And unfortunately, we're not looking beneath the surface. We have to understand that Planned Parenthood is very good at putting a very, very acceptable veneer on their true agenda. And you have to dig. but upon digging, you'll be horrified. Know that they are only fulfilling an ideology that began with its inception, which is Margaret Sanger's eugenic plan to exterminate, to reduce, to create genocide with nationalities or ethnic groups that they felt were inferior. The key thing to understand is that this is what they believe. I used to believe that this was all about money. Now, it is about money for many, but with the core group of eugenics believers and the brain trust of Planned Parenthood, it's ideology. Eugenics is the targeting of any ethnic group with the goal of either controlling the propagation or the fruitfulness of that group when it comes to birth, or exterminate that group. And the key thing is targeted, and also the key thing is that the goal is to reduce. Genocide is when you are already now in motion with your plan to reduce, and you're now beginning to have the effects that you desired. The numbers are decreasing. Numbers are decreasing. The birth rate is going down. In the African American community today, it's at 1.97. You need 2.1 in order to maintain the present population. Presently, because of abortion, we're at 1.97. We're already beneath the replacement level. And so then at that point, you can say, your plan is working. You've gone, you're awarded in the eugenics community with be able to say that your work is now a genocide. There's genocide going on in the African American community, and if with any cursory search at all, one would be able to truly find the culprit, and it's abortion. And that's how we gleaned the name Black Genocide. It was from Jesse Jackson. Abortion is black genocide. What happens to a mind of a person, the moral fabric of a nation that can abort a baby without a pang of conscience? Where will we be 20 years from today? And I went down to help Trent Franks, who currently is under pressure, doing just what you just asked some people to do, step out. He stepped out and said 52% of all pregnancies, African American pregnancies, end in abortion. That's a fact. That's the truth. And people are calling him racist. People are calling him names and ridiculing him for making that comment. And so this is the absurdity of this. First of all, it's a fact. Second of all, it's the truth. Third, it comes from Alan Guttmacher, who sat on the board of Planned Parenthood, who happens to be very proud of that statistic because that's what they're getting paid to do, kill black babies, bottom line. And so if you want to know about how many black babies are being killed by abortion, you go to Alan Guttmacher. I wouldn't even go to this to the census. I wouldn't go because many states don't report. But most of the abortuaries, most of the clinics are some way connected to Planned Parenthood, and the Alan Guttmacher Institute is privy to that information. So, bottom line, people do not want to know the truth on this matter because they're going to have to make some changes if they acknowledge that this is going on. So you even have in Atlanta, where they have billboards presently talking about the African American is an endangered species. And so what's the left's response? Okay, let's call them racist, and we'll put this type of pressure on them. Back in '99, Reverend Dr. Johnny Hunter and myself got together and we gave a clarion call and said we're going to go down and lay 1,452 roses on the steps of the Supreme Court. Nobody answered that call. A few did come with us, Star Parker, Damon Owens, a few pastors who went part of the way with us, and I can't think of their names right now, but God bless them, and I thank them for any participation. But that led me to know right then and there that there was going to be very much an uphill battle. And yet we did complete it. We laid 1,452 roses at the Supreme Court to bring attention to the number of African Americans killed each day by abortion. And that's why I had to be called blackgenocide.org. Please, you know, who gives a hoot about L.E.A.R.N? But black genocide, what's he talking about? You know, and people go to the site. And they, you know, people go to the site. There's weeks I do over 200,000 people on that site. You know, your listeners ought to know that abortion is the most performed operation on a woman. If there's 12% African Americans in this country and they're accounting for, I'm going to use this figure, this is extremely conservative, 37% of the abortions of the nation. Yeah, that's 37%. That means that African American women, you know, are having this operation performed on them more than any other woman. And to the point where that it is genocidal when it comes to the number of live births. Why did I say that? Well, up until 1973, breast cancer was not an issue with African American women. It was not a problem. Now it's epidemic. And Joel Brin, who's from this great state of New Jersey, more or less did 28 studies, 21 conclusive, that there is a link between a woman who has an abortion, especially a first-term pregnancy, and chooses to abort, will, over 500% in some studies, have basically will contract breast cancer. And there's a recent study in Turkey, they concluded 66% of women will contract breast cancer. Your chances increase 66%. And it's simply because when you miscarry, when a woman miscarries, the brain knows it and sends messages throughout the body, shut down. When you surgically do it, and you abort the child surgically, brain does not recognize that, and it continually sends signals, and what organ is affected by it the most is the breast of a woman. By the time it begins to shut down and realize there's no child, there's so many hormones and other things that are there, and they become cancerous later on. Now, African American women now lead the country in preterm deaths of their children because abortion is being sold to African American women as a contraceptive, which is unquestionably the most detrimental thing other than the death of the child, because you're now have created a situation with this woman that she's not able to carry full term when she wants a child. And so preterm deaths, once again, was not an issue in the African American community, and now they lead the country in that. Then there's a psychological problem with abortion, and I say psychological problem. It is this: the industry does not recognize, I'm talking about the medical industry, postpartum abortion syndrome. Now here a woman can miscarry and she can go through postpartum, but you're saying a woman that chooses to abort or may not choose to abort, coerced into abortion, will not go through postpartum? This is absurd to me, but that's presently the problem. There was a study done in Dayton. 85% of the women, 125 women did the study. 85% of them reported some type of psychological or physiological, but basically psychological malady. 55% were going through depression. Close to 60% were still crying. And no one wants to recognize this. And then here I am, the African American preacher, and if you know anything about the African American church, it is predominantly women. There are predominantly a number of women. In some cases, for every one man, there's 8 women in a church. For me to know these statistics and not think they're in my pew, and not think that they're not visiting my church in pain, hurting, suicidal, increased drug use because of trying to bury themselves in that pain, increased alcohol, trying to hide from the pain of something missing, And so the health ramifications, let's leave the pro-life, pro-choice, Republican, Democrat, Independent out of it for right now. How can you, NAACP, I'm really upset with them, how can you push Rainbow Coalition? How can you, Congressional Black Caucus, not have a forum where doctors, I don't need to come in. Everyone knows my position on the social activism part of this and the moral position on this. You need to talk to with doctors who would validate what I'm saying and authenticate the data so you can now National Advancement Association of the Advancement of Colored People, so the colored people can advance in their knowledge of this. Right now, you are advocating the decline. You're the antithesis of your name. And so the NAACP really needs to be held in account. I'm very much encouraged at the fact that Julian Bond is no longer there and that there will be another board president, and I'm hopefully that we can have some type of dialogue on this as a health issue. They're not supposed to be political anyway. So why are you making it political by not allowing this information to come forth? Is there any other reason why you would not allow this to come to the floor for discussion? So it is very, very frustrating to me that men and women can get up in the morning and censor information from other men and women that can make their lives better. It's very sad. Silent No More, Georgette Forney is a very good source to contact. Your listeners need to contact. When it comes to the data, they stay on top of that data pretty much, and it's very, 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 very important that women get this information. And it's very important for leadership to get this information, but it'll stagger you, the things that are going on with women when it comes to abortion that media refuses to write about or address. The National Cancer Research, a defector, has admitted that they have hid the data of the link between abortion and breast cancer. This is something like this in a movie. I mean, you don't believe this stuff is going on, and yet it's factual. Well, right now, as stated, I think that Alan Guttmacher, the Guttmacher Institute, is the most safest place to get most abortion statistics. We find that he is saying that there's 1,786 African-American children each day killed by abortion, just under 4,000. I think the average abortion costs around $450. As Alan Guttmacher that reported that 52% of all African-American pregnancies end in abortion. The ties presently, if you would go on Wall Street, you would find some of the most lucrative companies that have basically accumulated a lot of wealth quickly. They did so basically because of the slave trade. And yet it's those same entities you'll find, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, that have profited from the slave trade and amassed all this wealth, are now major players in the eugenics movement. In other words, the worth factor is now, insignificant. It's not any advantage for them to have African Americans here. And before, I think it was Dick Gregory that said that during slavery, African Americans couldn't have babies fast enough. Then he said after slavery, there became a moratorium on having children. So this was the mindset, more or less. It was to no one's advantage. It wasn't to their advantage for them to see the African American population to grow. But yet these are, even today, very extremely wealthy businesses and entities, but yet if you do any of the research, you find that it was more or less accumulated during the time of slavery. We were trying to, as a course, follow the money. There were eugenics boards in states throughout this country. These states more or less practice sterilization. They practice, of course, giving out contraceptives, but punishing African Americans, minority children, minority women with sterilization, and also withholding benefits from them if they chose not to be sterilized. Coercion of this, unquestionably, even today, it's a little bit more subtle, but at that time, benefits were withheld. Benefits such as food stamps or food supplies. So it is unquestionably something of a ideology that has been prevalent, especially after slavery, and about controlling the numbers of minorities and African Americans. The last eugenics board, I believe, closed in 1981. I think it was Portland's. But to make a long story short, the government began to see the problems of being in the eugenics business in this nation. You had the Tuskegee incident. And so this was bad press. They began to say, it'd be better if we withdraw. And of course, the reason why they could withdraw, there was someone else who had already changed their name, and that was more than willing to continue the eugenics ideology, and that was Planned Parenthood. And to date, once again, if the taxpayer doesn't know it, $350 million last year went to Planned Parenthood from the government. And this goes through both administrations, Republican and Democrat. And so you find that Planned Parenthood, I believe now is the number 2 or 3, became a mega institution from these resources being poured into them by the government. Why? The government got out of the business, and Planned Parenthood said, we'll do it for you. And so, but the good part about it is that people are beginning to understand and to connect the dots and realize that this is being perpetrated against minorities, and it is deeply because not only, as I said, if abortion was not lucrative, it would not be legal, but there's still a very strong ideology and belief that when you can control the minority, the African American, especially in Africa, the NSSM policy of this country to make sure the numbers of African Americans do not grow, so they would not be able to control the resources of Africa. That's validated, it's documented. We heard tapes of Nixon and others talking about this. It's sad, but nevertheless true. As a matter of fact, the study said there has never been a successful way. The only way that has ever worked in foreign land to reduce the numbers of a population, and that was to bring in abortion. And so you'll find that in any time that there is in any way, you know, you're talking about coercion. Okay, we're coming to your aid, Haiti. We're coming to your aid, Ghana, whoever. Whenever they come, you do not get the aid unless you take the birth control. You do not get the aid unless you accept our method of teaching you how you're going to express your sexuality. And if you don't accept the birth control, if you don't accept abortion, you don't get the aid. Now, believe it or not, that happened in Katrina, at the Katrina. So this is undoubtedly something that is, if they cannot be by deception, it is by coercion, and it is a means that is unquestionably being done today more stealthily. But when it comes to third world, it is coercion, and when it comes to this country, it is basically 85% of it is deception. One, leadership, African American leadership, is disgracefully in bed with the abortion industry. And two, the censoring of information, you know, in the interest of choice. Choice implies you've given me the information so I can make it an informed choice. If you hold that information from me, you have an agenda that I would not make an informed choice. and therefore I'd be fitting into your plan. And so these choice advocates are hypocrites, because if it was about choice, they'd be sitting right here with me. You may not even agree with my position on it, but because you're an advocate for choice, you know that means anybody who would censor information would be wrong, because I'm going to use that information to make a choice. So with the African American community, it's been the censoring of this information and not allowing the truth about abortion to come to the forefront of discussion.